Okay, well, it is 9:02, and I'm Richard Kravitz, Director at UCCS, and it's great to welcome all of you to the Summer Session 2021 Undergraduate Research Showcase. It's always a great time. It's the highlight of the year. I'll keep my remarks really, really short, but many of you who are presenting may be a little nervous, but don't be, because we're really coming together to celebrate your achievements. I think many of you have discovered that you were able to accomplish a lot more than you ever thought you would. And you did this through your own efforts, as well as with the support of your instructors. And a special thanks should go out to your internship hosts who have created these real world opportunities for all of us. And we are indebted to them. So we really look forward to your presentations and seeing what you've got for us. And without further ado, let's get started.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Kravitz. So the format for today's Undergraduate Research Showcase is that each student will present. After the student presents, we will take one question from the internship host site. If there isn't a question from the internship host site, then we'll turn the question over to our academic team. We will have an open Q&A at the end of the session as time permits. And with that, we're going to go ahead and have Juan Flores present. And this term, he did his internship with the California Department of Public Health. Juan?
I have shared my screen. Do you see my screen?
Not yet, but I'm sure it's not. There we go. We see it. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay. Perfect. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Juan Flores, and today I'll be presenting on food insecurity in California. Food insecurity in California is truly an ironic problem. California has the 5th largest economy in the world, and our agriculture produces more than half of the fruits and vegetables of our country. On average, all counties in California have decreased food insecurity by 14% from 2011 to 2019. In order to understand this amazing progress that we have already done to reduce food insecurity, I set out to identify factors that lead to this progress, as well as opportunities to further prioritize and focus our policy efforts to maximize reduction in food insecurity. As such, I ran a multiple regression analysis between 5 independent variables. The first, the cost per meal. 2, self-sufficient standard, which is the minimum income a family can make in order to survive without any financial assistance like SNAP. Number 3, median household income. Number 4, unemployment. Number 5, percentage of enrolled in CalFresh out of the total eligible population. I looked at 2018 data, which is the most up-to-date data for all of these variables. And in this regression model, what I was able to calculate is an R-squared of 83%. And what this means is that 83% of the data fits in this model, which means that these independent variables are really good at predicting food insecurity. However, there was only two variables that didn't make the cut, which is cost per meal and the outreaching to and enrolling people in CalFresh out of the total eligible population. And so overall, my research suggests that we should prioritize on unemployment and addressing other cost of living factors to further address and reduce food insecurity. On the map on the right, I show Senate districts and rent burden. Rent burden is when 30% or more of the income goes specifically towards rent. And so by prioritizing these darkest blue districts, we can reduce the financial stress on these families in order to promote financial security and promote food security. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Great, thank you so much, Juan. And so if we can go ahead, if there's a question from CDPH, if you can just go ahead and raise your hand, I'll call on you and unmute you. You will likely need to go ahead and unmute on your end as well. All right, Renee Bradley.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Hi, thanks so much. Wonderful presentation, Juan. I'm curious about two things. One is, why do you think CalFresh was not, significant in terms of your analyses? Why didn't it predict what you expected it to predict? And I'm also curious, you noted on your slide that we should deliberately use CARES Act funding, to address this. I'm wondering what you would prioritize, like to say your top thing that you would say we should do with the CARES Act funding, given what you learned.
Yes, thank you so much for your question. So for the first question, to CalFresh is uniform, and it's defined by the federal poverty line and federal poverty guidelines. And these are very outdated standards. They don't take into consideration cost of living, especially in California, where we have such varying cost of livings throughout each county. And so we should focus on rather a back-end approach to addressing food insecurity, because CalFresh is, universal, it's universally defined, but not necessarily addressing specific and localized cost of living factors. And as for CARES Act funding and COVID resources, I included that because local health jurisdictions and local governments received funding in order to further support their community. And for that policy strategy, I thought it would be a good opportunity to promote local small businesses, as well as ensuring that we pipeline money directly into the community to promote economic security through that, since data on food insecurity during COVID times is still new. I thought that CARES money would be a good opportunity to match any needs that we're not currently seeing in trends and reporting.
Great, thank you so much, Juan, and thank you so much, Renee Bradley, for the question. And so our next student today is Jenna Hoh, and she actually interned this term with the Cal Air Resources Board.
Hi, good morning. My name is Jenna Hoh, and I'll be presenting on environmental education. Environmental education in the United States began with the passage of the Environmental Education Act of 1970. California has since built upon national regulations by passing their own environmental education policies, such as the Environmental Education Initiative in 2005. In 2018, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released a special report citing a behavioral bias as one of the largest roadblocks to climate relief. They suggest comprehensive environmental education at the K-12 level as a solution. If environmental education is a critical step on the way to climate relief, it is integral we evaluate the environmental education already in place. In my project, I measured the success of an environmental education by the environmental literacy of its students. Environmental literacy is an individual's understanding and motivation to make responsible decisions for the environment. I identified 7 factors that constitute environmental literacy. In order to evaluate the evolution of environmental education since 1970, I figured if environmental education has been moving closer to its goal of fostering environmental literacy, we should see increased levels of environmental literacy at a younger age rather than at an older age, because the younger age received a more polished environmental education. In order to see this trend, I surveyed 175 Californians on questions aiming to measure the respondents' environmental literacy. Each question corresponded with one of the 7 factors of environmental literacy, and answers were scored on a 1 to 5 scale. These scores were then added to create a comprehensive literacy score. Once this was completed, I found there was no statistically significant relationship between age and environmental literacy. This suggests environmental education has not consistently evolved to foster higher environmental literacy. I suggest California looks into passing a more binding environmental education policy, where is a requirement rather than a suggested curriculum. A possible way to accomplish this would be integrating environmental education into the next generation science standards, which are the science standards adopted by the State Board of Education in California.
Great, thank you so much, Jenna. And so if there is a question from the Cal Air Resources Board, if you want to go ahead and raise your hand, I can go ahead and call on you. All right, and then if not, a question from our academic team.
Hi, Jenna. I just wanted to ask you a question kind of on your policy suggestions here. So you're, Professor Anguilla. So what do you mean we say create more binding legislation? Could you give some example of what that might entail or what we might be able to do to help with environmental education going forward?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So far, environmental education policy sort of looks at environmental education as a suggested curriculum rather than something that should be necessarily integrated into science standards, which is why I brought up the next generation science standards, which are a guideline. It's still not necessarily concrete, like that someone has to follow it, because that's very hard to do in education policy. But most public schools in California do follow those. So if they took more aspects of environmental education and sort of integrated those into those science standards and sort of, because the science standards are specific to each grade level. So if there was an aspect of environmental education at each grade level, I believe that would lead to fostering higher environmental literacy. And since those science standards are sort of generally accepted as the norm in California public schools, I think it would be more successful than sort of just having these separate environmental education policies that are sort of more just a suggested curriculum.
Thank you.
Great, thank you, Professor Tulla, for your question, and thank you, Jenna, for your great presentation today. And so our next student I'll be presenting is Carol Lee, and she interned this term with the Local Government Commission.
Can you see my poster?
No, I can't.
No? Sorry, let me do that again. I apologize, everyone.
We can see it now, although it's the small version. So there we go. I think that's gonna.
Okay, thank you, Cindy. And good morning, everyone. Sorry for that delay. My name is
Carol. Actually, so it's still small. It kind of went a little bit bigger than it went.
It did. Okay.
So sorry. So
I think I was behaving so well earlier. I apologize again.
From the start presentation, I think it will.
How is that?
Perfect. Great. Thank you.
Okay, I am sorry about that.
Oh, no.
And so again, thank you, Cindy. Good morning, everyone. And for my project, I examined the relationship between redlining and the urban tree canopy in California. Redlining created an institutionalized system of racial, economic, and geographic segregation. The Homeowners Loan Corporation, which I'll refer to as the HOLC, was empowered to draw residential security maps based on perceived, investment risk that led to the systematic denial of financial services to entire neighborhoods. Decades later, studies reveal a strong relationship between redlining and environmental justice issues. Recent heat waves in California have brought attention to the cover and heat disparities in cities that disproportionately affect low-income neighborhoods and communities of color. Temperatures can vary by as much as 20 degrees between neighborhoods within the same city. I hypothesized that neighborhoods with higher HOLC grades are associated with higher percentages of tree canopy cover. To study this relationship, I layered 2018 tree cover data with shapefiles of HOLC maps of 6 cities in California to calculate the percent of cover in each HOLC defined neighborhood. Then I tested differences between grades within each city for statistical significance. To see the distribution of tree cover within and between grades and to locate extreme outliers, I plotted my data with box plots as seen in figure 2. I took the average percent of tree cover for each grade and plotted that in a bar chart as seen in figure 3A. The differences that are statistically significant at the 5% level are highlighted in figure 3B. My hypothesis was only true in Los Angeles. However, across all cities in my study, large and significant differences in tree cover exist between formerly redlined neighborhoods or the D-graded neighborhoods, as well as C-graded neighborhoods compared to A-graded neighborhoods. I conclude that redlining practices are a factor in persistent inequity in urban tree cover and recommend planting and maintaining trees in older inner city neighborhoods, specifically those with little tree cover. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Carol. And so if there is a question from the Local Government Commission, if you can just go ahead and raise your hand, I can go ahead and unmute you on my side. All right, and then if not, a question from the academic team.
Hi, Carol. This is Professor Anquila here. I wanted to get a little more in depth into some of the policy suggestions of what you think you could help to kind of alleviate some of these issues for these areas that were redlined, or for some of these C and D graded neighborhoods.
So I'm going to actually borrow from the Air Force for this one. In terms of tree planting, I really think of it as like mission always people first. So we can see these gross inequalities in the average values as well as in the graph with the outliers. So some communities have up to 60% tree cover, and there's a large number of communities graded B, C, and D that have less than 10% tree cover. So I think the first and most important thing is to plant more trees in these red line neighborhoods that have less than 10% tree cover. I mean, this will make not even immediate, because tree canopy does take a moment to grow, but the differences that will make in heat differentials, how it will help filter air pollution, that has to do a lot with the land use practices also done in red line neighborhoods, things like eminent domain. And I think a good way of doing that would be to update environmental justice laws. So California does have statute environmental justice laws, but that more covers an excessive burden of environmental harms, but doesn't really address the inequity in environmental amenities, in this case, trees.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Fila, for the question. And thank you, Carol, for a great presentation. And so our next student today is Emily Lennon, and she interned this term with Cal EPA Border Affairs. Emily? Great.
Good morning. My name is Emily Lennon, and my project focused on cultural background and environmentalism. In 2020, nearly 10,000 fires burned over 4.2 million acres of California. Now, as we know, greenhouse gas emissions drive climate change, which exacerbates wildfires and other environmental issues. Recycling is just one individual action that can significantly reduce the production of greenhouse gas. Yet currently, California only diverts about half of its waste stream. At the same time, California is the most diverse state in the country, yet environmentalism remains heavily associated with whiteness, as seen in Figure 1. I thought that factors like history with immigration, multilingualism, and ethnicity may have an underemphasized role in influencing environmental behavior at the individual level. So my research question was, how does cultural background affect recycling behavior among adults in California? I conducted a 9-question survey with a sample size of 169 adults. I first looked at the relationship between immigration generation and rates of recycling, and found that first-generation immigrants, or people who immigrated themselves to the US, were most likely to not recycle at all, and least likely to recycle aluminum, glass, and plastics. Further, as immigration generation increased, so did the likelihood of recycling always, or most of the time, as seen in Figure 2. However, Figure 3 shows that first-generation immigrants, though they recycle the least, also had the fewest number of people who had no environmental motivations for recycling. Lastly, I looked at recycling behavior across language and found that French and German speakers were most likely to not recycle at all, but generally recycling behavior varied across language. For these reasons, I suggest that makers of environmental policy pursue ways of influencing individual behavior that take into account particularly recent immigration status and linguistic differences. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Emily, for your presentation today. And so there is a question from Cal EPA Border Affairs. So, oh, great. Elizabeth King.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily, for the presentation. This is such an important topic, and thank you for doing such a great job. I was wondering if you could elaborate on how you measured environmental concern value mentioned in Figure 3.
Yes, thank you for your question. So environmental concern value was measured through the question, why do you recycle? In which I provided respondents a list of reasons from which they could choose multiple. And among these reasons were 3 environmental related reasons, including to prevent pollution, to conserve natural resources, and to reduce waste. So the environmental concern value is actually how many of those reasons that they chose as personal motivations for recycling. And the reason I looked at that value was because I hypothesized that more recent immigrants would have lower rates of recycling, but I didn't think that it would be because they cared less about the environment. Thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Elizabeth King, for your question. And thank you, Emily, for a great presentation today. So then our next student is Ylen Pack. And this term, she interned with the UC San Francisco Philip Lee Institute for Health Policy Studies.
Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Ylen Pack, and my research project is on COVID-19 health outcomes and its relationship to Medicaid expansion status by state. Since the Affordable Care Act, many states have chosen to expand their Medicaid eligibility requirements, but 12 states still have not, leaving millions uninsured as they don't qualify for either Medicaid or for marketplace subsidies. And the COVID-19 pandemic has only amplified concerns over the uninsured. So my research project focused on the question, do COVID-19 health outcomes differ between expansion and non-expansion states? The hypothesis is that expansion states will have better COVID-19 health outcomes as measured by lower rates of mortality, case counts, and severity indicators. Using data from the CDC and the Census Bureau, I ran regressions looking for relationships between expansion status and COVID-19 health outcomes while controlling for state demographics. And in the state demographics, I included state political atmosphere, which is a measure of the COVID-19 policies a state has adopted during the pandemic. When looking just at the averages, it seems like expansion states have less cases and mortalities and more hospitalizations, intubations, and ICU admissions. But regression analysis actually found that there is no significant relationship between expansion status and COVID-19 health outcomes. However, there is a significant relationship between the political atmosphere of a state and the COVID-19 case counts. I also looked for differences in hospital service utilization and found that expansion states report fewer financial barriers to care. All of these findings imply that Medicaid seems to be working in increasing hospital service utilization, but the lack of a significant relationship between expansion status and COVID-19 health outcomes signifies the need for more assessment of Medicaid's effectiveness in targeting the populations that it tends to benefit and not just a focus on expansion. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Ylen. And so if there was a question from UC San Francisco, you can just go ahead and raise your hand. I can go ahead and unmute you on my end. All right, and then if not, we'll go ahead and go over to our academic team. And if you could raise your hand, I can go ahead and call on you. Great, Professor Butters.
Hey, Ylen. It's Dr. Butters here for Paul 185. So this is a great project. I know we just talked about this recently, but I was curious if you had put in some more thought into the idea that maybe there's some interesting variation that maybe occurred over time because the pandemic's been going on for a very long time, it feels, and has been, right? So you pooled this data together across time. Do you think there'd be some interesting variation that you might be able to capture if you were to expand this analysis and do maybe a time series analysis?
Definitely. So my data looked at an overall cumulative total of the case counts and mortality rates from the beginning of the pandemic up until July. But there is a lot of variation. If we had done a time series analysis, it may have provided a lot more insight into the not only the variation in the waves of COVID-19 cases that we saw throughout the pandemic, but also in pre and post vaccination status. And so one of the things that we had discussed was that before vaccination, the populations and the ethnic minority groups that were being affected by COVID-19 the most may have been different from the populations being affected the most after vaccination. This might also be due to the types of populations being vaccinated and getting vaccinations the most. And so had we done a comparison of for example, a monthly analysis of COVID-19 cases and the health outcomes, we may have seen different analysis results as well. But thank you for your
Fantastic.
question.
That's a great answer. Thank you, Ylen.
Great. Thank you, Professor Butters, for your question. And thank you, Ylen, for our great presentation today. And so our next student is Tara Robinson, and she interned this term with the Cal EPA Environmental Toxicology Office.
All right, can everyone see that?
Yes, looks great.
Perfect. All right, my name is Tara Robinson, and I'm doing my project on Prop 65 warning labels, which you guys may have seen in your everyday life, like on a can of paint that reads, "This product can expose you to chemicals, including X, which is known to the state of California to cause cancer." So Prop 65 was passed in 1986 in an attempt to reduce the public's exposure to harmful chemicals. It requires labeling in places or on products that expose people to these chemicals. And these labels also seek to incentivize businesses to reformulate their products without these dangerous chemicals, so they don't have to include warnings and risk losing business. Strangely enough, the warning label language is the same for every chemical, regardless of if it's known or merely suspected of causing cancer, by a host of expert bodies such as the US EPA or OSHA. So my theory is that if the warning label language were more precise in clarifying a chemical's cancer risk, then people would be more confident in understanding their health risk from exposure. So to get at this question, I conducted an experimental survey of 175 California residents, where respondents were randomly shown either the normal Prop 65 warning label shown in the top left corner of Figure 1, or an experimental label that used EPA cancer classification language to qualify a chemical's cancer risk, which is shown in blue in Figure 1. Then respondents were asked to respondents were asked to measure their confidence on a sliding scale. So in terms of my findings, there was no significant difference between the confidence values among the experiment and the control. However, those who got the experiment labels typically rated their confidence slightly higher than those who had the control, except for benzene, which had a very small difference between the labels in the first place. There's also a vague negative correlation between how often people saw Prop 65 warnings and how it impacted their purchasing behavior, which perhaps indicates that warning fatigue could be at play. And most surprisingly, people are generally quite willing to look up more information on the chemical at the URL provided on the label, which indicates to me that these may still be a relatively effective, informative tool. So my recommendations going forward would be to conduct some more surveys with a larger N, as well as a random sample in order to assign greater confidence to these results, as well as continue to use simple language when conveying your cancer risk so that every single person can read these labels and understand the risk that it poses to them. That's my project, and let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Tara. And so if there is a question from the internship host site, so Cal EPA Environmental Toxicology, you can go ahead and raise your hand. I can go ahead and unmute you. All right, if not, then a question from the academic team, and you can just go ahead and raise your hand. And then I can go ahead and call on you. All right, Professor Quila.
Hi, Tara. How are you doing? I had a question about the one significant finding it looks like you had here, which is about benzene liquid chemical, and in terms of looking at more information at the URL provided. Do you have any thoughts as to why that was the one where there actually seemed to be some sort of significant difference, or why that is kind of one people were more willing to look up when they were in the experimental treatment?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So benzene was the one that actually had the lightest treatment between the control and the experiment. So the fact that this was the one that had the most statistical significance was actually quite interesting. The difference between the two labels is one said known to cause cancer and the other said known to cause cancer among humans. Perhaps because it said among humans in it, people were kind of prompted to consider like what the human exposure studies might have looked like, that word to prompt them, including this language on the warning label. But it is kind of an interesting interesting finding that this is the one that was statistically significant while everything else wasn't. But I would guess probably just because among humans implies that there have been human exposure studies in the past that people might have been interested in looking up.
Great, thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Professor Quila, for the question, and thank you, Tara, for that great presentation today. And so our next student is Flor Sanchez, who interned with the Local Government Commission.
Hi, good morning. Is my screen
Yep,
shared?
looks great. Thank you, Flor.
Okay, good morning. My name is Flor Sanchez. So as Californians, most of us have experienced the skunky smell that accompanies marijuana. According to the California Healthcare Foundation, the age groups of 18 to 25-year-olds reported a 34% use of marijuana. My research focused on the relationship between marijuana use and UC students. There are potential side effects of using marijuana for college students, such as impaired decision-making and a lower GPA. My hypothesis theorized that the legalization of marijuana in California has led to more weed dispensaries and therefore an increase in marijuana use among UC students. I collected data from 3 UC schools, UC San Diego, UC Los Angeles, and UC Davis. As Figure 1 shows, Prop 64 legalized recreational use in 2016, but it did not become legal to sell in dispensaries until 2018. On Table 1, it can be seen that the 3 schools had at least 3 dispensaries within 10 minutes of the campus. In Figure 2, it can be seen that on average, there was a use of 17.63% before Prop 64. After 2018, when it became legal to sell in dispensaries, on average, the use of marijuana among the 3 schools was 23.66%. This was a 6% increase in use. This leads to the conclusion that legalization of marijuana did have some effect on students' current use. While all UC campuses have some sort of prevention program of drugs and substances, I would recommend for more awareness to be brought to the resources offered to students to prevent substance abuse. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Flor. And so if there is a question from the local government commission, that'd be great. Just go ahead and raise your hand. I can go ahead and unmute you. All right, and then if not, from our academic team, if you can raise your hand, I can go ahead and call on you. All right, if we can go with Professor Waite.
Hi, thanks, Flora, for your presentation. I find this really interesting. I was wondering what you thought about the connection between dispensaries and the UC students, which, from what I understand, marijuana, being able to buy it at the dispensary, you have to be 21, and most students at a university will typically be under 21. So I'm just wondering what you think about policy recommendations in terms of legal action or how they might be acquiring the drugs.
Yeah, thank you for the question. That's actually a very interesting question. I did look at the average age of students in undergraduate programs, and the average age does seem to be 18 to 20-year-olds. And I think weed dispensaries, I didn't really look into their regulations, but I think that policies should be, mostly in UC campuses, should be more enforced. There is warnings, and among all UC campuses, programs preventing this substance abuse. But I think the resources offered to the students in educational programs on the side effects of marijuana aren't very much exposed to students. So I think that would offer an incentive not to buy weed if they knew the health effects, the overall health effects and long-term effects of the use of cannabis.
Great, thank you, Professor Waite, for that question. And thank you, Flora, for a great presentation today. And so our next student that'll be presenting is Garbita Shah, and she interned this term with the California Council on Science and Technology.
Okay, is everyone able to see that?
Yeah, looks great. Thank you, Garbita.
Okay, awesome. Good morning, everyone. My name is Garbita Shah. Thank you for being here. I chose to do my project on the rising maternal mortality rates in the U.S. So after seeing an increase in maternal mortality over the past 2 decades, in 2018, the March on Dimes declared the U.S. the most dangerous nation of the developed world for someone to be pregnant. And that same year, compared to the national maternal mortality average of 17.4, California saw a maternal mortality rate of 11.7. So my research began with understanding what California has been doing to drive down its rates, but more specifically, it asked, what is the impact of healthcare access on maternal mortality? So to test my hypothesis, I did a state-by-state comparison between California, Texas, New York, and Georgia, collecting a snapshot of data from the year 2018. To measure healthcare access, I used 3 measures per state. The first being healthcare access scorecards. Secondly, I looked at the number of birth attending healthcare providers, specifically the number of obstetricians and I looked at the percentage of uninsured women. So to analyze this, California has some of the best rankings in healthcare access out of the 4 states, and it also has lower numbers of uninsured folks. California has the largest number of birth attending healthcare providers, and when it comes to birth attending healthcare providers, specifically midwives, the other states have significant shortages. So there are significant gaps in data, and nationwide there are racial disparities that exist in maternal mortality rates. As a society and as a state, even though California has the lowest rate, we are not doing enough to be addressing this issue, considering that most maternal mortality is preventable. We can't really call ourselves successful until our rates are closer to 0 and we are closing the racial disparities. So as the data suggests, we can work towards this by implementing policy that ensures and increases more access to equitable healthcare. And with that, I will open it up to any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Garbita. And so if there was a question from the California Council on Science and Technology, great, Puneet Balar.
We've had the pleasure of hosting Garbita this semester. Congratulations, Garbita, on a great presentation on such an important topic. I have a two-part question for you. First, can you explain why you chose those 3 other states that you did for your analysis? And also, can you briefly explain what a high intervention medical model is?
Sure, yes, thank you for the question. So I chose my other states, mainly because Texas and New York had larger population sizes, so it made for good comparisons to California. And then across all 4 states, the birth rates were relatively similar. And Georgia in particular has some of the highest maternal mortality rates in the nation. So it was worth looking at. I really wanted to look more into Georgia. And then to address your second question, so a high intervention medical model is something that California has implemented since 2006, and it's worked to drive down overall maternal mortality rates, specifically by 55%. However, the same racial disparities that exist on a national level continue to exist in California as well. And so there are a lot of practitioners and then members of communities that argue, specifically for communities of color, that a high intervention medical model is likely causing some level of harm in clinical practices. And what this needs to be integrated with is more holistic models of care, making sure that we're centering communities of color and tracking things like access to healthcare coverage and who's able to actually get to their prenatal postpartum visits, things like that.
Great, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Puneet, for that question. And thank you so much, Garbita, for a great presentation today. And so our next student is Julia Sherman, who interned this term with the Cal EPA Environmental Justice Office.
Can you see my screen okay?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. Hello, I'm Julia Sherman, and I did my project on incarceration in California, specifically looking at recidivism rates. California has historically high recidivism rates. As demonstrated by my first figure, spends above average on how much it spends per inmate each year. This inspired me to look at what could help reduce recidivism rates and also make the most effective use of the corrections budget, leading to my research question of how do the budgets for education programs in prisons impact recidivism rates. I hypothesize that a higher budget for education programs will decrease recidivism rates in the state. For my research, I analyzed the relationship between the recidivism rates in 6 states and the education costs per inmate. I also looked at the overall costs per inmate and the recidivism rates in the respective state to compare to the education costs per inmate. As my second figure reveals, the higher budget for education programs in a state, the lower the recidivism rates, although Texas was an outlier. This data mostly supports my hypothesis, as does figure 3, since it shows there's a stronger correlation between recidivism rates and education budgets than with the overall budgets in prisons and the recidivism rates. My third figure shows how recidivism rates drastically differ depending on how they are measured, which each state does differently. As such, I recommend a future study using more recent data and with the time and resources to use comparable recidivism rates and budgets for each state. It was also surprisingly difficult to find data for many of the states, so future studies could also look into those states more. Further research should also be conducted on what else can impact recidivism rates, such as state policies and rehabilitation programs. But in conclusion, my initial findings were that education budgets, the increased high education budgets in a prison system, the lower the recidivism rates. Thank you for your time.
Great, thank you so much, Julia. And so if there's a question from Cal EPA Environmental Justice Office, you can go ahead and just raise your hand and go ahead and call on you or unmute you. Elizabeth King.
Hi, Julia. Thank you for such a great presentation. This is really fascinating information. My question is around the Texas outlier. I'm curious as to if you have any ideas why their education costs per inmate might be so low, and also maybe why their recidivism rate might be so low.
Yes, so for Texas and also the other states that I mentioned that have overall lower prison budgets, I would definitely recommend more research. But I would also assume that part of the reason the education budget was so low is because emphasis on education in prisons really began in the last 5 to 7 years based on the readings I did for my research. So the data was taken from right before there was a larger emphasis on education. So I'm sure if you took more recent data that there might be a big shift in how much the budget is focused on education, although I may be wrong. So that's why I think there definitely should be future research on the topic. And then as for recidivism rates, as I also mentioned, recidivism rates greatly differ depending on how they are measured, which each state has a different primary method for measuring recidivism. So I did the return to prison rate. And so for Texas, that happened to be very low. But if you looked at it for arrest rates, it might also be really higher. So it kind of just depends on how they're measured, which is why I also think the future study should be conducted with more comparable recidivism rates and budgets. I hope that answered your question.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for the question. And thank you so much, Julia, for a great presentation today. And then so our next student is Vishal Tulla, and she interned this term with the Cal Air Resources Board.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. And I think my poster's up, right?
Yep, there we go. It looks great.
Awesome. So hi, my name is Vishal Tulla, and my project is focusing on implementing check dams in farming communities located in drought-prone regions throughout California. These communities rely on shallow wells to provide drinking water, but intense droughts and the overpumping of groundwater dry these wells up. My project targets replenishing the water level of the aquifers below the wells by testing the construction and implementation of check dams across streams. Check dams, made up of bags of gravel, work by slowing down the flow of water runoff, making water available for increased water infiltration or percolation to the groundwater table. Therefore, the presence of a check dam increases the level of the groundwater table. To test how well check dams work in arid regions in California, I developed an experiment that can be conducted by measuring the groundwater level of 3 different locations near a river, 1 year without check dams and 1 year where check dams are implemented and tested. To create a check dam, burlap bags filled with gravel will be staggered across a body of water. And on top of these bags, a few more bags will be put on top, creating a second layer. Lastly, rocks in that region will be added on top of these layers. But how do I know that check dams work well in replenishing groundwater levels? So according to the t-test I did using research done in India, the p-value is found to be really, really low. So we can actually accept the alternate hypothesis that the means are different. And with the check dam, the groundwater level was almost 20% higher within a year compared to the case without a check dam. Therefore, drought-prone regions in California should implement check dams to assist in replenishing groundwater reserves. This project still needs to be tested in California, so a way to bring this about would be to amend or develop a California bill to allow for this experiment to take place. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Vishal. And so if there's a question from Cal Air Resources Board, if you want to just go ahead and raise your hand, I can go ahead and unmute you. All right, Susan Hay.
Hi, thank you so much, Vishala. This is really interesting and a great project and presentation. My question is, since you have been helping us with legislative analysis here at CARB, what legislation, if any, do you think is needed to advance this type of water conservation effort at the state level?
So I definitely think it should be a public bill. And I was actually considering speaking with one California's representatives. I think actually the representative of the 2nd district, and I was considering actually reaching out to their team. And I know that he actually is very interested in legislation that works with helping drought-prone regions in California specifically. So I know that I would have to, since the public can offer ideas for a bill, but we can't actually create a bill, I'd have to definitely speak with him and try to see if I can create something. But yeah, for now, I think that just kind of putting that idea out there and seeing if anybody wants to kind of take it on and make it a bill would be great help. So
that's great. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Suzanne, for a great question. And then Vishala, thank you so much for a great presentation today. And so our next student is Efren Vasquez Gonzalez, and he interned this term with the California Department of Health and Human Services.
Okay, sorry for the background noise. You're fixing my street, so my apologies. Okay, there, present. Okay. Can everyone see it or no?
Yeah, it looks great, Efren, and we don't hear background noise, so you're good.
Okay. So hi, my name is Efren Vasquez Gonzalez. I am from the University of California, Merced. I'll be presenting my research on the issue of education during COVID-19. This pandemic has brought many adversaries to low-income students in California, such as having inequities in high-speed internet, a quiet space, and much more. The reason why I'm very interested in this is to showcase awareness to these students and also showcase how a pandemic has changed the education of low-income students in California. This leads to my research question. How has COVID-19 impacted the education of low-income students in California? Based on prior studies to the pandemic, the California Department of Education and numerous news media such as the Ed Educational and Cal Matter has observed a decline in educational reattainment from low-income students. Now, more low-income students are not continuing their education due to the pandemic, and regardless of legislation such as SB 130, which provides an alternative education to students, there remains hesitancy from low-income students to continue their education. So I hypothesize that as COVID-19 prolongs, more low-income students will feel discouraged to continue their education. For my research design, I used the Public Policy Institute of California and United States Bureau to analyze how students are interacting with their educational future. I used a large N study to analyze parents and students. Also, I focused on the 2021 year in California. Why use the responses of low-income parents? The reason is because the parents' influence will impact a student's viewpoint on education and also how they're handling their education. Why analyze the low-income students? By analyzing the factors that they're using, it'll be apparent why students are viewing their education in a negative manner. My policy suggestions is to have a more, have a statewide government program. And my conclusion is that that the federal and state government must provide additional assistance to low-income communities. Forgot to analyze, but thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much, Efren. And if there's a question from the California Department of Health and Human Services, if you want to raise your hand, I can go ahead and unmute you. All right, Noah Fullerton.
Thank you. Great presentation, Efren, and great topic to be looking into. I just wanted to explore, I see your recommendations there. Also, do you believe that the expansion of broadband that the state is looking at now will help alleviate some of these inequities and work towards solving this issue?
Yeah, I do believe that creating more government programs and expanding these will kind of be a first step into the situation, because there's no clear or permanent solution. There's always going to be numerous blueprints to create a solution to this. So with these programs that will, or these kind of ideas or solutions that will allow for among K-12 students to help one another and also kind of speak out about any inequities.
Great, thank you so much, Noah, for that question. And thank you again, Efren, for your great presentation today. So then our next student is Ellie VanDigna, and she interned with Environment California.
Okay, let me just. Okay, can everybody see that?
Yep, looks great. Thank you, Ellie.
Awesome. Okay, hello, my name is Ellie VanDigna, and today I'm going to be presenting my research about net energy metering and solar adoption. And so the main research question I wanted to address was, does the financial incentive from net energy metering influence if people add rooftop solar panels? And I think it's important to dive into some background with California having the goal of achieving 60% renewable energy by 2030 and 100% clean energy by 2045. And some drastic ambition action is needed to meet those goals. And rooftop solar is a great tool to tackle that. And in California, we use net energy metering, which provides solar customers with a return for their excess electricity produced by their solar panels at a retail rate on their utility bill. And it essentially rolls back their power meter when their panels generate more electricity than they're using. And so net energy metering has gone through 3 versions, and the 3rd version is set to come out in 2022. And so my theory and hypothesis is that if financial incentives from net energy metering continue to be available for solar customers, then there will be an increase in the amount of households with solar panels. And to understand this, I looked throughout the years and used data from the US Energy Information Administration and Solar Energy Industries Association, and used Form EIA 861 to look at the net metering data and kind of see if there was a similar trend between the two. And so I was able to see that there was an increase in capacity and kind of see that over time with that energy metering, that it hasn't been as consistent, as close of a trend as I was expecting, but it is interesting to see how solar capacity has increased, and there has been some fluctuation in the PV sold back. And I think the dip in residential PV kind of highlights the transition from NEM 1.0 to 2.0 during 2013 to 2015. So I thought that was really interesting to see. And policy-wise, it is important that we try to increase solar adoption and prevent California investor-owned utilities from making policy changes that will cut net energy metering and have incentives for people to increase solar. And with that, I'll leave it up for questions.
Great, thank you so much, Ellie. And so if there is a question from Environment California, if you can just go ahead and raise your hand, and I can go ahead and unmute you on my end. All right, and if not, a question from the academic team, if you can go ahead and raise your hand, I can go ahead and call on you. All right, Professor Betters.
Hey, Ellie, Ross Betters here, Paul 95. Great presentation. Thank you for this. I like solar energy stuff like everybody else does, I think. But I'm really curious. I mean, that big drop there, I think you mentioned it there, that there was in your figure from 2013 to 2015, we're switching from 1.0 to 2.0, but I was just hoping you could just tell us more, because that drop is like severe and almost total, right? From 2012 to 2013. So I mean, maybe it is the case there's some sort of transition period, but it's so much that I was just wondering if you could just tell us more about that and what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting because there was subsequent legislation before 2.0 as well. So there was a lot of back and forth with policy changes. And it was, I think, a big adjustment because NEM 1.0 kind of just introduced the topic, and then 2.0 made some changes to it. And kind of, I think that's also when adoption was kind of starting to rise a lot too. So yeah, it's definitely interesting to see how far it went down. But yeah, I think it is just a lot of policy back and forth. And that's why it will be interesting to see with 3.0, hopefully we don't see a drop like that again, because that's quite concerning.
Well, yeah, it looks like it never really even recovered ever. Actually, by 2016, everyone back up to those same levels of even 2011. Mm-hmm. So that's pretty interesting. That's interesting. Yeah, thank you for your answer, though. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Professor Butters, for that question, and thank you, Ellie, for a great presentation today. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and give Brooke just a second here so she can go ahead and stop the recording before we go